Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly King, product marketer at LaunchDarkly, and here to welcome you to our webinar, Managing Risk in Modern Software Delivery. In today's session, we'll hear from industry leaders on how top engineering teams are rethinking release strategies to protect customer trust, reduce downtime, and ship faster. I'm pleased to be joined today by our own co-founder and CEO, Edith, as well as leaders from DraftKings, Josh, and Clari, Leonid. Now, first, a little bit about LaunchDarkly. For anyone new to us, we're a comprehensive feature management platform that helps teams reduce risk and accelerate software delivery, whether for traditional apps or for cutting-edge AI deployments. Our platform enables progressive delivery, safe experiments, and precise release control for some of the world's most innovative companies, including 25% of the Fortune 500. Now, just a little housekeeping before we dive in here. We've curated a few helpful resources under the Docs tab. Feel free to explore them anytime during or after the session. And just a few quick notes before we get started. Use the chat to share your thoughts and engage with fellow attendees. I know I will. And if you have any questions, drop them into the Q&A tab. We'll address them throughout the session and during our live Q&A at the end. All right, now without further ado, I'm here to welcome and introduce you all, Edith, Josh, and Leonid to the stage. Edith, take it away.
Hi, welcome. I'd like to thank Josh and Leonid for being here with me today. If you have not read the Harvard Business Report, I highly recommend it. Today we're going to go through some of the stats and what they saw in their own teams. So my first question is, the report found that 56% of orgs still face release errors monthly and most rollbacks are still manual. How have you two seen that play out in your own teams?
Josh, you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I can take it. So I don't know if that's not true in my teams anymore. So we started embracing DevOps about 4.5 years ago, I'd say. We were using like a big bang approach where we were rolling out maybe twice a month, and a lot of times there was actual rollbacks because of the amount of code. Ever since we moved to DevOps and using small batch size and releasing, every day, hundreds of times a day, in a lot of cases, we don't really have it anymore. So it's just modernize your development approach. Greatly reduces the amount that you actually have to roll back, and then using just modern, using LaunchDarkly has helped us actually. The rollbacks are now really rolling forward with a fix. So we either just have to turn things off or just put up a fix to a small PR. So that's been the way we've been dealing with it since we've embraced using modern DevOps in the last 4.5, 5 years.
Gosh, that's a great approach. And in areas of Clari, it's similar for us. At Clari, we also at the stage of our company, and I assume you guys are as well, where we started growing through M&A. And therefore, we're not exactly running consistent code base or consistent processes across all the products. And quite frankly, after one of the acquisitions, we did something controversial. We turned continuous delivery off. We were delivering too quickly to production because we didn't have enough test coverage. And until we built up that test coverage, we wanted to be a bit more measured, because at the end of the day, as a SaaS vendor, service, quality, stability, performance of our applications are paramountly important to our customers. So what we started focusing, depending on the area of our product lines, our approach started focusing on separating code release from actually turning on capabilities that face the customers. This is why I'm happy to be here with the LaunchDarkly crew as well. That is an absolutely required piece of toolkit for us to enable us to separate getting the code to production as well as when we roll the code. Additionally, we, over the last few years, took a very deliberate segmentation approach to our customer base. And again, leveraging the tools, get the customer segments into this place. I'll give you a simple example. A lot of our customers, one of our key products is allowing our customers who are sales team run their forecasting processes. Those of you who've been around the business enough know that a typical forecast call happens on Thursday, but some companies do it on Tuesday. Some companies do it on Monday. we decided that in order to minimize any change risk, because we all know that failure starts with some kind of change in our production systems, we're going to segment our customers by the day of the week of their forecast call. And as we're thinking about turning capabilities, we actually use those segments or cohorts of users where we may deliver this functionality to separate different cohorts on a different day. And then, of course, rollbacks. Josh, you talked about how hard it is to roll back, and like roll forward has been historically my professional experience. Very few teams achieve that clean rollback ability. And while we have it at our disposal, it still takes longer than simply flipping a feature bit and turning a particular capability off. Although the caveat is you have to think about this as you design your code, obviously, and we have to change the mindset of our development teams to make sure that we can, at will, flip the feature on and off, and also consider about interdependencies. In a complex multi-team environment, you run into things that depend on each other. And how do you make sure if you turn one thing off, the other one gets off? So that approach historically worked incredibly well for us. We looked at the metrics and we took our change failure rate down over 70%. And then we introduced the concept of a pain score. So we measure each incident, and we measure it both on the time as well as the impact and the breadth of the impact. We call it the pain score at Clari. We also were able to reduce the pain score substantially just because the mean time to repair by simply turning a feature off and reducing the blast radius have reduced drastically for us.
That's fascinating. So how long end to end did this whole cultural transformation take? And how much did you let your customers know that this was happening? For example, that they were in different segments for releases?
Change is hard. I've been in engineering leadership for over 20 years, and now my job is managing non-deterministic variable feedback time machines known as humans, and they don't like to change. None of us like to change, especially engineers. I think you can successfully, it's highly situational for us. We were able to transition to that approach in about 4 or 5 months as a deliberate effort. It was important for us, so that was driven as a key initiative for us. Obviously, there's change. Like when you show up to every team and says, "Hey, now you have to attach everything you do to a feature bit, right, or a feature flag." You have to give them some guidance because one can go quite extreme on instrumenting everything. And then there's a conversation about, do you have a deliberate process on cleaning those feature flags after you're done with them, right? We all talk a lot about how valuable those tools are, and they're incredibly valuable. But they can also create code-based complexity, and test matrix can explode if you're not managing those things responsibly. Let's just use that word. So the tail end of the process, for example, took longer, but we now use both AI tools that help us remove the unused feature bits, as well as manual process changes. For example, now the PRs that come in with a new feature flag have a PR attached to them that removes that, so the code was written together. Yeah, that took about 6 months to get this process rolling across about 30-ish different Scrum teams across 4 product lines. Wasn't too bad, but it absolutely took energy.
And
did you find once people started using it? I guess my experience is once people started using it, now they won't go back to, even though they fought it like a little bit in the beginning. Now I don't think I could get people to do
Josh,
releases without feature flags.
All it takes is one incident that gets resolved in 10 minutes by simply turning something off and waiting till the next morning so you can fix it during your workday with the teams that are available, versus spending hours building a hotfix at night to embrace this capability. At least that's my experience.
Yeah, exactly.
I've learned this from one of the leaders. I have a conference talk on kind of transforming processes, and one of the headlines from that talk that applies here to your question is, pain is instructional.
There's the old joke when you go to the doctor and you say, "It hurts when I do this," and the doctor says, "Well, stop doing that." You can't really do that with software. If you're a software engineer, you got to release. I mean, Josh,
Yes.
you talked in the report about the morale hit when engineers are woke up at night because of bad releases. Do you want to talk about how your org deals with culture and morale?
Yeah, so this goes back to kind of the impetus to change. I remember at a time where we're like one of our principal engineers was trying to go on a fishing trip, and he was like bringing a sat phone with him in case something went wrong. And we're like, man, something's got to change. If somebody's so important that they can't leave without a sat phone, he lives in Canada, and then to go on a fishing trip. And so that was like a big thing to go, how do we make changes to this entire process? Because it leads to burnout. The amount of time you get woken up, and then the amount of time you spend on it, you come into work, you don't feel good the next day because you got a page at 2 a.m. And I think there's a cultural shift happening right now. Like when I started, about 20 years ago, it was almost like celebrated if you got called in and you got paged at night, and people were like all for it. And now I think we're like, this is unacceptable that people are called in, and we're either like some companies are compensating people for their on call either with time or money. I always try to give people time off because it is a huge interruption to your daily life. It's a huge interruption to all that, just like your work life, and it's unsustainable at a enterprise level, I guess. So to me, that's like the biggest thing I'm like trying to work on this year and next year is like, if there's a world where we could live without on call, how do we get there? I don't know if it'll ever totally exist in the space that I work in, but how do we get as close as possible to that?
Yeah, that's why I started. Sorry, go ahead, Landon.
Josh, I just want to say I'm not optimistic about not a world without a simple reason. I used to be a software engineer once, long time ago. My team does not believe me at all. But nothing, again, taught me how to, for example, put better logs in place than having to wake up needlessly at 2 a.m. and going, only if I had that log line right here, this piece of code, I would not be spending hours troubleshooting this. So I think it's just, on-call is just part of growing up and maturing. The question is, how do you make sure that on-call is not unnecessarily painful, right? And how do you, to our previous conversation about the process change, how do you tie the process that nobody wants to adopt to the fact that it's actually there to reduce that pain? And I think if you are able to do it successfully in your organization, that's what gets that process change going. Sorry, Edith, back to you.
Oh no, you just reminded me of why I started LaunchDarkly originally. I had been in engineering, and I think you start to have this culture that values people that are fighting the fires, the people that are on call at 2 a.m. But after you've done that for a number of years, you're like, well, why do we keep having all these panic 2 a.m. calls? Like, what systems and processes can we put in place where this doesn't happen? So that's a lot of what. And like, go ahead.
Agreed. I'm a recovering observability vendor in the previous lives, and we used to say you don't send the surgeon on every ambulance call. Why do we wake up the most senior engineer to troubleshoot every single incident?
Yeah, and how can we have processes in place where these incidents either don't happen because you talked about progressive rollouts, or that we have a system where it's easy to roll things back quickly and easily. Which kind of leads to my next questions around, the old way, these big bang deployments, the manual rollbacks, it seems to me not the right way to be building software. Did you have a specific one turning point where you decided you needed a different way, or was it just a series of events like the satellite phone example you gave?
For me, I think it's a series of events, and just having we had a few outages and then a few rollbacks, and then I don't know if everybody went through the same thing that I did. I read Accelerate, and when I read that book, we read it as a group. We started a book club just to read Accelerate, to adopt these processes. And that to me was like one of the biggest light bulb moments, was like we could just improve our engineering, I guess our processes, and there's definitely evidence if we do it right, it's going to be less painful. So Phil, for me, it was just coming into a new company. I said started at Jackpocket about 5 years ago. saw some of these processes are antiquated, and then just said, how can we really make it like the best engineering place that we could work at? And a few of us just took that on, and so it's more just like, where would you want to work as an engineer? And the place that I would want to work is a place where I, was using feature flags, where I could ship fast. So I didn't have to worry about every 2 weeks there being a huge issue. And it just came from that, all these things coming together.
I have a different experience, and it will vary by company. What I've seen is the three patterns, Ethans. Once, teams that have the scars on their back try to layer some of this process early on before the team scales up a lot, because this is where it's the type of foundation, the cultural foundation, the technology foundation is inexpensive to layer, right? And that's maybe 30% of the teams that I have seen. Other teams realize that something is not trending well, and they start deliberately taking away capacity, because then the day in R&D, it's a zero-sum game on investment. If you're investing your calories in this, you're not investing in something else. And the question is, how do you situationally balance what the company needs with those investments? And then I've seen teams, and I've been involved with team where it's gotten to the point where it's starting to hurt the business, and then it becomes an emergency surgery, right? And really, my approach to this, at least as an engineering leader, and my advice to everybody would be, figure out what's their and if you look at R&D investment, there are typically three big buckets for a product company. There's roadmap. There's run the business, all the things we need to do to keep the lights on in the business. Security bug fixes, ongoing enhancements, bugs, et cetera, et cetera. And there's an architectural roadmap of some kind, or architectural or technology roadmap, right? And if that investment is set, and most companies I've been to run this at 50% roadmap, 30-ish, the lowest I've seen for RTB, run the business 25, and maybe 15 to 20 for the architectural runway, is the question really becomes, how do you prioritize things in your architectural runway? For example, at Clari, our last process change was driven through an architectural runway initiative, and we've chosen this to be more important than other architecture initiatives, and that's how we drove the investment. Different companies will do it differently. Maybe my lesson in the past, if you didn't catch it early and you didn't set that DNA early, you're going to be doing this either begrudgingly after things gotten to the point where they don't work anymore, right? Major incidents tend to trigger those types of culture and process changes. Series of major incidents tend to trigger that when the pendulum swings. Or you catch it in that early journey and you start deliberately making progressive, small incremental investments. Now, the frustrating part about that middle journey is it takes longer than anybody would like.
Josh, anything to add there?
No, I think you covered it all. No, that covered everything.
In the report, progressive delivery and segmentation were highlighted as key ways to help customers. Landon, you talked about it a little bit. Do you have any more examples about how you're using segments, or Josh, do you have any?
I'll start. Our business is highly seasonal. So since we sell to revenue teams, we look at key business events that our customers have to handle. And our business is also highly seasonal. For example, weekends are quiet. Not a lot of sales activity happens on the weekend. Outside of our global companies that start the traffic starts picking up Sundays for us. We'll look at business relevant examples such as day of the forecast. We can look at end of quarter dates. End of quarters are important, incredibly. Like last week of the quarter is probably the most important week for a lot of sales teams. Unfortunately, in enterprise software and in general in sales, a lot of business gets transacted that way. So system stability is paramount, and not everybody is on the same fiscal year. So we'll look at that as an example dimension. Risk aversion of the customers. We have customers that have various change management windows internally. So Clari sells typically at the top end of the market to somebody who's called a RevOps persona, right? Revenue operations. They have internal customers. So my job, our job as the vendor is to support them in front of their own internal constituents at the company. So they have various inputs that put that segmentation. And in other companies, I've seen seasonality. For example, I used to work in, I think it is when you were starting the company, I was at Taleo, and we were actually looking at early days of LaunchDarkly. At Taleo, hiring for some of our customers was incredibly seasonal. If you think about retail, right, September to November is where they make a lot of seasonal hires to make money. So I think it's highly relevant, and I'm curious to see how Josh and the crew think about this for DraftKings. It's very dependent on the business, and I don't think there's one rule of thumb to rule them all. Josh, how do you guys do it?
Yeah, we take a little bit, I guess, different of an approach. So we could have a different. So like for us, we'll either target users based on their location. So if we want to roll out a new game or something, we could roll that out just in Massachusetts or whatever. And then we could also develop most of our customers are going to use iOS or Android, right? So we can have two different development paths for both of those things for the same feature. They might not be done at the same time. So we also release those. So we'll segment by iOS, Android, and then it could even go to the operating system depending on how far back we're going to go. Like some operating systems are just not going to get as newer features, but we still want to be able to make sure they have access to our applications. So we do a lot of that type of stuff for segmentation and targeting. The other thing we'll do is when we roll out a new feature and we're just trying to understand if people are going to use it, rather than spend a bunch of time up front thinking we know what the customer wants. We'll spend a shorter amount of time, then we'll release that feature to a smaller group of people. Then we start to try to, see if our, theory was true on what they actually like. And then as we build out that feature, it goes from 5 to 10 to 50% or whatever until it ends up becoming a feature that everyone sees. That's been the way we look at I guess segmentation is just basically to just either just going here's our rules engine type of thing, or we're testing our own theories.
Yeah, again, part of why I started LaunchDarkly was that idea of testing theories. At TripIt, they taught us to fight back against the hippo, the highest paid person in the room. So we would build, kind of a base case of a feature, roll it out, see if people liked it, and then roll more. What I've seen a lot at LaunchDarkly is we have customers in very regulated industries, where, for example, they're not allowed to release in certain windows because of various either legal reasons, or just sometimes because, for example, if it's an airline, there's actually a training window, and you're not supposed to ship releases because something might change literally mid-flight.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I think the headline, it sounds like between the three of us, right, is everybody will have different approach to segments. For example, Josh, I cannot do it by user across my customer base because that does not give my administrators of my customers predictability. So I do it at the customer level, and then we may be able to target users. You guys do it by user, region. I think the headline is you need the flexibility to have the dimensions that you truly care about in your business. And that's the lesson I'm taking out of this discussion.
So if the way we're releasing now feels different than it did, 5, 10, 15 years ago, what is the feeling you feel in your own way you operate or in your own teams that feels different?
So I think the big thing for us has been the change. The newest change is adding the guarded releases into the mix there. Initially, it was trying to see what we're looking for. When do we want to turn this feature off? So actually putting looking for those things, whether it's telemetry or a business metric or something like that. Thinking of that stuff in advance is the new, I guess, the new dimension to release that we're facing. And I think we started 8 months ago where we're making our own, and now we're adding telemetry in, which has made things easier. I that's a completely new way of thinking, where you're thinking about all those business metrics, and like, hey, latency or whatever it's easy, but when you're actually thinking about how many users go through the login page, what do we consider a failure? When do we want to turn this off? Like, how many people don't buy a ticket or whatever it is? Having those statistics that you're looking for up front, you're actually forced to kind of think of the change that you want in your feature before you actually release it. So I think that's it's a paradigm shift for engineering, and it's a paradigm shift for product managers.
To design for success and failure up front.
Yeah. And make sure you like pinpoint what you're looking for, so it's in your code basically. Well, now you're not just looking at, because a lot of times what we would do is we'd go into Looker or whatever and go, okay, this made this change. Do we consider it successful? Now we're looking at it going, is it successful? In with guarded releases, are we going to turn it off, right? Did we screw something up along the way that now users are not able to log in? Are we not getting transactions in the amount of time? Is it taking longer to get through a step process? That's just a different way of thinking versus looking at your analytics after you put something out or after you do an experiment.
I think it's slightly different for us. For us, those capabilities allow our incidents to be shorter, less eventful, and less exciting for everybody. And that's always good about an incident. Josh, we talked about the change management, and I mentioned the pain score in the past. One of the ways we motivated the teams to adopt this technology is we heavily weighted MTTR in the pain score calculation of the incident to demonstrate to the team that you can lower the customer pain. And it's always nice when it's true if the incident lasts shorter. And the fact that the rollback instantaneous with feature flags has been great for us. We rely slightly less on automation for now. We're still progressing with our segments, just because in some of our features, change management is required for administrators of our system. So if we roll something back, we have to tell them that something we launched, we took away. So we take a much more manual approach, but having the capabilities there and kind of being on that crawl, walk, run journey towards completely trusting the machine to do this for us is exciting. Because the number of those things, as I mentioned, if you're successful with changing the culture, the number of concurrent changes you're running is going to increase substantially. So slightly different approach, just because we're a B2B company with customers who have internal customers, but absolutely nice to let the machine do bulk of the work for us. The machines never sleep, as I say it is, and they're much better at hitting the rollback flag than waking up a human at 2 a.m. in the morning.
But they're not as funny and clever as you two. You still have that.
I don't know. With modern LLMs, they go after that too.
Well, speaking of AI, the report shows that AI is both increasing release velocity and introducing new risks. How are your teams preparing for this new class of risk?
This one is the thing this makes me nervous more than anything, because I think it breaks the rule of batch size, because it's churning out so much code now. And I would say, of the things you do as an engineer, code reviews are probably your least favorite thing to do. So now we're introducing more code reviews. And if your pipeline is just not there yet, like if you have a bunch of holes in your pipeline, or you're still manually releasing, I think AI is going to be a nightmare. You're going to have way more on calls. It just goes against a lot of the things that the best practices, I guess, that we talk about. So I think the first thing is you have to have your basics down. It has to be all buttoned up before you start introducing a ton of AI code into your pipeline. Otherwise, you're going to have people up all night, every night. I don't know if Leonid, you feel the same way.
Well, listen, as an engineering executive, I want those tools to help, because they do help deliver more value to my customers quicker. With a caveat that at this current stage of detooling and the ability, I feel like I've given a scalpel to some of my most experienced surgeons And for somebody who just finished med school and never touched a scalpel in their life, and they can do as much damage as you can do with a sharp instrument as quickly. So the question becomes, how do you enable, for me, the more experienced people, and how do you protect yourself and the system from the less experienced people? Because Josh, as you said, AI, we're going to be living in the age where we produce much more code. Not only that, we're probably going to produce the code that we don't understand as well, right? And I think observability vendors are going to have another field day soon, just because we're going to increase the volume of stuff we push. The change velocity will increase. And it's not clear that we will be able to support that change velocity with the existing processes. Much like when we went from waterfall to agile to continuous delivery, we had to go change how we orchestrate software. I think we're looking at another inflection point in how we build end-to-end SDLCs. I talked to a lot of the vendors in the AI coding space, and one of my asks to them, and what I've been asking every single one is, help me understand, what are you doing not to like make me write the code faster? What's your POV on changing the entire SDLC, right? How does this capability of me being able to click a button and write a bunch of code that I never read changes how we do everything downstream?
Exactly.
It's a brave new world. I think we're going to be living through it for another few years.
Yeah, I totally agree with that metaphor. Again, when we started in 2014, people were still moving from waterfall to more agile with continuous delivery. I think of AI as more like a continual tidal wave of code that just you cannot turn back. But you do want to be able to manage and control and shape into something that suits the needs of your customers.
That's a great analogy. I think it's that water flow that you have to go and direct to where you want it to go, because AI generated code, like real water, it will find every nook and cranny, and water will do whatever water does. And we all know how powerful that is as a phenomena. Edith, I'm shamelessly stealing that one from you.
Oh, go for it. I think that's why I still love software is, I do think that this will make it easier to build good products, but it's, as you said, it's just making sure that people are using it effectively.
Yeah, my headline is, like, if you look at the history of my industry since the 50s, I was doing a conference talk back in May, and one of my favorite quotes we found for that is, I will never trust the code I didn't write myself. And that was heard for the first time by no other than Grace Hopper in 50s, when she introduced the idea of a compiler. As we go as an industry, we keep continuing to introduce new levels of abstraction, except that those new levels of abstractions require they give us additional power, but they require a new set of tools and processes to wield that power responsibly.
100%. I think you're always moving up the stack. You don't have to write an assembly code anymore, and I view that as a good thing. Well, we're wrapping up. Do you two have one final bit of advice or lesson learned that you'd like to share with other leaders before we switch to Q&A?
I guess I can just go. My biggest thing of advice is, like, adopt these modern practices. It makes everyone's, I think it makes engineering's life better, and it makes it wherever the place you're working in, it makes it a more attractive place to work, and it reduces, like, anxiety on your, like, or disappointment on your customer side. For me, that's been, like, those are the two biggest wins of adopting DevOps, like, best practices.
Plus one on everything Josh said was one, caution. What I've seen in a lot of teams, and I was very happy when the LaunchDarkly team assured me that our situation when it comes to feature flag count is not the worst that they have seen, is adopt those things responsibly and think about the full life cycle. A lot of places where I've seen kind of forget the tail end of the adoption, which is you're done with the flag. You need to have a life cycle for it, and you need to remember to remove it. because what I have seen is a flag sprawl. I've seen incidents because of flag misconfiguration or incompatible flag settings. So yes, 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 and yes, and all the best practices because the benefits are there. But also don't forget about things that I've seen a lot of folks to forget, which is the tail end of the feature flag lifecycle. How do you remove it? When do you remove it? So your system does not become this giant sprawl of permutation of configuration that become untestable and unmanageable.
Completely agree. One of my most popular talks used to be the top 10 ways not to use feature flags. It was some of the poor practices I'd seen and how you could get into a lot of trouble if you had, for example, bad naming practices, stale flags.
Oh, yes.
Flags that nobody understood is a classic one, and the one that just you're like, I don't know what that does, but I can never remove it. So we've tried to
actually we should find that talk and surface it back because I think it's going to be as relevant for this new AI era as ever.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started giving talks in 2014, I would ask people to raise their hand if they'd ever used feature flags or feature toggles. Now they're just a best practice, and now we as a vendor are just trying to help people understand how to use them better. So we've tried to make this a very vendor neutral talk. I will say we can help, but even if you're not using LaunchDarkly, please just use good design patterns because they'll make your life better. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly for some Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Edith, Leonid, and Josh. Such great insights. We've heard the risk of the status quo, the opportunities of guarded releases, and even a glimpse into the future of what resilient software delivery looks like. So now we want to hear from you. We've got time for a few questions in the audience. So please drop your questions in the Q&A panel, and we'll take a few of them now. If we don't get to you, we'll do our best to follow up async. You've attended this. We've got your email. We'll be in touch with you. But I do think we've got quite a few to pull from. So I'm going to start here with a question from John. How do you feel about the concept of testing in prod, like Netflix, using targeted feature flags that only the testers can see features you want to release? Anybody, feel free to take it.
I would say do this as much as possible. If you can get to this point, there's certain things you'll never be able to do. Like we sell lottery tickets, right? You can't sell. You can't do that. The whole thing in prod, but you can do a lot of the other parts. So we have created groups for manual QA to be able to run through a lot of these different processes. So you're actually seeing it in a live environment, and it does remove some of the staging issues where that environment might be different. And at some point you could even say, I'm going to get rid of stage and reduce just infrastructure costs. I don't think we never got that far, but this is definitely something that we go for in as many features as possible.
I'm going to be controversial, and I'm going to say I completely disagree with Josh. I don't. What concerns me in our industry is for a while everybody wanted to be like Netflix, while nobody was like Netflix. And there are a number of dimensions about that our industry tried to emulate too early or without the right people, infrastructure, process. It is absolutely fair to say that there are certain things in certain situations where you can only test on production. It's impossible to reproduce the production environment testing. At my last gig at SignalFX, we were processing a couple billion data points a minute. So for me to build a test environment where I could go test it was nearly impossible. Having said that, though, I discourage experimenting on customers, especially in B2B software. Never a cool thing to do. So yes, if you test in prod, make sure you experiment on people that know that they're being experimented, and do it judiciously, because I've seen teams where let's test it in prod, or let's be like Netflix was an excuse for YOLOing it and abandoning all kinds of other best practices such as automated test coverage, observability, reproducibility, not knowing how to configure an environment, et cetera, et cetera. So my advice to you is be cautious about what you test in production and make sure you do it for the right reasons.
Yeah, I mean, along that line, usually you'll have one or some subset of customers who like seeing early features, and they can opt in. They're like, hey, we want to see that new feature because we want to give you feedback, and they're a willing participant.
100%.
Yeah, we do internal users on that too. So you would have a user ID in our database. So that makes it so you would release it to whoever inside of our QA team.
Awesome. I think we have room for one more quick answer question. I'm going to tap on Victor. He asks, how do you deal with stateful resources like database schema and API breaking changes?
I'll go. We avoid them. I have a talk that I think is 15 years old on refactoring database schemas. If you haven't seen the database refactoring book from Edison Wesley, I think it's a Martin Fowler signature series. Highly encouraging you to read it. Same with API breaking changes. We guard them with feature flags. And we avoid them, especially in a complex microservices environment, because they rob us of ability to roll back quickly. It's a different level of discipline, but the value from that discipline is incredible.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo the same thing. We follow the same practice there.
See, Kelly, we sometimes can be short, so maybe there's one more in there.
I think we are right at time. So Josh, Leonid, Edith, thank you.